All right, it's my enormous pleasure to be joined on Bad Faith podcast today for the first time by Professor Vivek Chibber. He is an American academic, social theorist, editor, and professor of sociology at New York University. Also behind Catalyst University. He is also behind Catalyst, a journal of theory and strategy, published by Jacobin Magazine. Welcome to Bad Faith podcast.
Thanks very much, Brianna. Thanks for having me.
I'm so interested to talk to you because we have many overlapping sort of concerns and preoccupations, including having this critique of identity politics and the way it has been weaponized by the broad left, by liberals in particular, and has become a sort of a substitute for substantive material politics in a way that I would argue has a direct through line to the political moment that we're in today. The lack of substantive fight the Democratic Party has been willing to demonstrate over the past decades, I would argue, opened the space up for Republicans to occupy this sort of pro-free speech, pro-worker, anti
globalization,
NAFTA, exactly, the kind of trade deals that are very much in focus as Trump litigates his tariff wars. I wonder how you see the connection between some of the critiques with respect to identity politics that you've been making over the past few years and our current political moment?
Well, the current political moment is one where the two parties have morphed into something that's almost unrecognizable from what they were, say, 25 years ago. 25 years ago, you had a Democratic Party that was shifting rapidly towards what we would call a neoliberal agenda, but where there was some kind of at least rhetorical nod to working class interest and what you might call populist commitments. There was a strong identitarian wing inside the Democratic Party, but it was not as explicitly mobilized against redistribution, against social welfare and social insurance as it has become the past 10 years. So it was trying to become the party of capital. It was not yet thoroughly the party of capital. Now we're talking here around the time of the end of the second Clinton administration, around 2000. It still had a decent sized working class base. The years after NAFTA had resulted in some degree of exodus by working class voters from the Democrats, but they still had a appreciable base inside that class. The Republicans, on the other hand, were committedly anti-redistribution. They were they were authoritarian. They were the people attacking free speech. They were the people who were pushing a globalized agenda. What's happened since then is that the Republicans find themselves, from their standpoint, saddled with the poorest districts in the country who are voting for them. The Democrats' electoral base still has some degree of working class support. Both parties will always have some degree of working class voters because that's the majority of the population. But while they still have some base in the working class, the de-alignment is true. It's real. A lot of the second Obama administration was when the second great hemorrhaging of working class voters took place. They have now more aggressively, they being the Democrats, embraced their more elite vote, the college educated vote. And since 2016, since the first Bernie Sanders campaign, their identitarian commitments morphed from being a kind of quiet, individualistic ethos of pandering to Black and brown elites, but without explicitly using it lined up against redistribution, to now essentially embracing a much more hostile stance towards redistribution, towards the working class, and a much more authoritarian cast towards political debates, towards academic scholarship. So it's this weird situation where you have both parties, still parties of elites, but both parties now lined up against the working class, lined up against working people of all races, engage in what really is an internecine war within the top 20 to 25% of the voting population. It's a war within the elites as to who's going to call the shots. The Democrats want a much more multicultural ruling class, much more multicultural political elite. The Republicans are still committed to an overwhelmingly white ruling class and political class, but somehow attracting votes from working class Black and brown people. So identitarianism has become the weapon that the Democrats have used to hasten their exit from their historical basis.
Well, the somehow is a big somehow and is a matter of a lot of debate. In the wake of Trump's 2016 run, I remember being confronted with the reality that any conversation that tried to understand why folks voted for Donald Trump, including why an increasing number of Black and brown folks had voted for Donald Trump, was met with a flat, no, it was just racism. And to the extent that people were minorities who voted for him, they're just self-hating. Now it seems perhaps out of desperation, now it's a second bite at the apple and he's running a much more authoritarian administration than he did in the first time around. There does seem to be some willingness to grapple with what some of these underlying issues are. And I wonder what you make of sort of the Democratic Party's maneuvers, which I would summarize as there's the AOC Bernie wing that is doing these oligarchy tours that are drawing out large crowds, and which I would argue are right with respect to messaging, although I have some skepticism as to whether or not they are willing to land the plane and genuinely put the Democratic Party in the crosshairs as part of that oligarchy, especially when election season comes back around and there is undoubtedly a Democratic oligarch on the ticket. And then also some of these internal questions and ostensible possible changes, like David Hogg, who's the DNC vice chair, talking about a willingness to primary Democratic incumbents, which of course has been met with significant backlash from other members of the Democratic Party, including Hakeem Jeffries.
Brianna, my reading of the situation is that Kamala Harris's defeat was kind of a clarion call, kind of a wake up moment for the Democratic Party, in part because of the small but still appreciable defection of Black voters to Trump, but in large part the explosive defection of Latino voters to the Trump coalition. And in some ways, you could say the Latinos saved us, because for 10 years, every criticism of the Democrats and pointing to the significance of Trump's resurgence, it was a Thomas Edsall answer that the columnist for the Times, who has pushed this aggressively for 10 years, which is it's all racial resentment, it's all the white working class and their racism, it's all the inveterate and unyielding racist core of American culture. They were just waiting to come out from under the rocks, and now Trump's giving them an excuse. So the idea was there's this unchanging, unyielding, independent, what Cedric Robinson would have called the ontology of race that will never change, et cetera, et cetera. And suddenly you get a big chunk of the non-white electorate, working class non-white electorate, that's going over to Trump. And you just can't deny that. So now the kind of the race entrepreneurs and the race mongering in the Democratic elites, who were the attack dogs on the Bernie Sanders wing of the party, they really had nothing to say. What are they going to say? So that, I think, was a moment of clarity for the Democrats. The other moment of clarity was that what is called wokeness, and I've taken a lot of flack for saying that it's real and that people hate it, but it is real and people do hate it. What is called wokeness, wokeness was the mutation of identity politics into something much more aggressive. Adolph Reed, in a recent conversation we had, said this is the moment when minoritarian PMCs went from a class in itself to a class for itself. In other words, they actually got a class-wide agenda to press for their interests as an emerging class of managers and professionals. It's really important to understand that became a thing because both the corporate elite and the Democratic Party backed it. They backed it because of their panic in 2020 at two things, which were the continuing popularity of Bernie Sanders and the explosion after George Floyd's murder of a popular movement, which, if it had coalesced with the Sanders' wing, could have led to a revival of the kind of Black and brown working class movements that you saw in the 60s, which would have been absolute disaster for the Democratic Party. They had worked for 20 years to extricate themselves from that. So the corporate, Jamie Dimon and all those people and the Democrats got behind a class-wide backing of a very aggressive push of an elite version of anti-racism. But that's backfired. Partly it's backfired in the public arena, Brianna. But what is less appreciated is that the very corporate wing that promoted it temporarily has gotten sick of it. And the reason they've gotten sick of it is that you could see it in a lot of the interviews they've been getting the last 4 or 5 months. They lost control of their corporations because upper and middle level management essentially started calling out the CEOs on social justice issues, which no CEO ever wants to hear. They're in the business of making profits. So here's the reason I'm bringing all that up is this. I think the defeat of Kamala Harris and the likely defeat in the midterm elections of the Republican Party and the possible defeat of the Republicans in the next presidential elections will see a Democratic efflorescence, the party taking power. But I do not think they will revert back to what you saw the last 4 years because their corporate backers don't want it. So what you'll see is this. Hakeem Jeffries is laying it out if you want to follow it. He wants the tech sector and the billionaires to come back to the Democratic Party. And he's slowly but surely, in various ways, signaling that they can take control of their corporations again, and the universities are going to be brought to heel. So to my mind, what you're going to get is if the Jeffries wing of the party is able to wrest and keep control, you're going to get something like what the centrists have been pushing for, what Obama and the Clintons have been pushing for the past 10 years. And it all comes down to whether Bernie and AOC will go down fighting or if they'll fall into line again, the way they did behind Biden. And if they do fall into line, I think this time around, the Democrats will clean house. I think they've had enough of these guys.
I think that all of that is very right. Do you have faith that Bernie and AOC are going to hold the line this time?
I think Bernie's 83.
Right.
I think he is chastened. I don't know what to make of AOC, to be honest with you. I don't know. Maybe she's learning. You know, the thing about Bernie is if you want to know what he's going to do, you just ask him and he'll tell you. And he just tells you exactly what his views are. I'm never quite with AOC. I'm not sure.
That might be right. But if I were to imagine, not that I am, the Bernie whisperer or have any great insight into the man, but I've been following him as closely as anybody else these last years. And I would imagine that if somebody asked Bernie Sanders in an interview, who do you plan to support in a 2028 primary? Would you support a Democratic nominee if it were Gavin Newsom or Pete Buttigieg or any of these kind of figures, Amy Klobuchar? That he would say, I will support the Democratic nominee. And I believe that because that's what he said when he was running for president. And that question was put to him, like it is always put to these candidates to ensure that ultimately they will fall in with the Democratic Party. And if they answer any other way, we all know the sort of media onslaught that they'll be faced with, and they'll be called everything but a child of God and an enemy of the Democratic Party and willing to throw the election to Trump and, a proto-fascist and all of the kinds of things we are used to hearing. And so, yes, I think that's what Bernie will say. And I would argue that that's a problem. And I have even less confidence in AOC. You said a moment ago that you think she's learning in kind of.
I said if she's learning. I'm
if she's learning. Yeah. Okay, I think she is learning. I think she's learning the wrong lessons. Her trajectory, her trajectory since coming onto the public stage has been to move to the right, not to move to the left. And to have an increasingly antagonistic relationship with institutions like the DSA, increasingly attenuated relationship with the left media figures that initially platformed her and helped her to gain national prominence. She has put nothing but distance between herself and the left over time, while at the same time increasingly courting a more mainstream audience. And when I look at those rallies and I look at their attendance and I look at the conditional support that they get from mainstream Democrats who say things like, I support that they are fighting. I like that they are fighting Trump, but I don't necessarily agree with their message. I don't know that we should be talking about oligarchy. I think they're focused on the wrong policy issues, but I like that they're fighting Trump. That is a signal to me that they are getting support. they are getting increased turnout only on the axis of being anti-Trump. And I don't have a ton of confidence that the Democratic Party will continue to support them or see the enthusiasm they're able to gin up as something that the party wants to take advantage of, as opposed to something that the party is afraid of and wants to keep under control. And given that I think you're right about the likelihood of the Democratic Party doing this neoliberal pivot in the next cycle and taking the backlash from Donald Trump and not using it to move to the left and deliver for working people, but to entrench themselves as a corporate party, that makes me even more frustrated that Bernie and AOC aren't using the enthusiasm that they have right now as an opportunity to warn against that exact kind of turn.
There is no universe in which the party embraces what Sanders is doing. None. It's zero. They have already, it's all the signals are out there right now. They are following the James Carville line, which is the rope-a-dope, which is you let Trump burn his bridges, you let him burn his base, you let Elon Musk run amok, and you just ride to power on a negative vote, on an anti-incumbency vote. The Democratic Party in the last two elections has shown without a shadow of a doubt, they would rather lose to Trump than win with Bernie. It's simply inconceivable that they see, oh my God, look at all these rallies. This is the way forward, as if they haven't known that for 20 years. There's no universe. So that's why I said, will they go down fighting or not? By them, I mean Sanders and AOC. Let me clarify what I mean by that. I don't think, Brianna, I don't think there's any way that Sanders runs as an independent or AOC runs as an independent. I don't see any way that they try to start a third party. And you and I might have different views on this. I think that's rational. Ralph Nader ran on an identical platform as Sanders did in 2000, and I was very much on board with that, and it crashed and burned massively. To my mind, what Sanders should be trying to do is fight for extract a pound of flesh from the party and consolidate his base inside the party in 2028 in a way that forces some kind of shift, some kind of concessions from the centrists within it. And here's why. I don't think that's going to be stable. They're never going to give him anything of any substance over the long run. What Sanders has to do, which is what he has not done in the past, what Sanders has to do is use all these rallies, use his concessions from the party as a way of opening up more possibilities for labor organizing and for the resurgence and the revitalization of the trade union movement, so that instead of going from election to election, hoping for a savior, hoping for the right kind of candidate who can electrify the voters, what you try to get is a strong base of ordinary people through trade unions, through civic associations, through neighborhood associations, who can on a permanent basis push the Democrats to the left to the point where you can have the kind of lasting electoral rule changes in campaign finance, in local redistricting, in local what's called going from winner-take-all systems to some kind of rank voting choice, things like that, where, Brianna, down the road, you can think about challenging the Democratic Party in some meaningful way. Right now, we're just not in a place where, as an electoral vehicle, a third party can really get you anywhere, you know? So we might be thinking in different terms about when we say, will they fight or not? The question is, what can they fight for? I think what they can fight for is opening up a space for more organizing of working people.
I guess my frustration, and I'm really interested to hear your views on this. My frustration is, and I don't mean to mischaracterize what you've just said, but there's a general feeling that I don't think is wrong that says real leverage comes from labor. We are at historically low labor rates, unionization rates, and therefore there is less leverage that exists. There are issues with business unionism and capture within unions and all of those kinds of things. And to that extent, labor is not determinative. It doesn't actually, it's not in this current moment able to push the Democratic Party in meaningful ways. We saw Joe Biden herald himself as the most pro-labor president of our lifetimes, had no energy behind passing the PRO Act, voted to crush the railroad strike. We saw Sean Fain sort of withhold his endorsement for Biden for a period of time and sort of articulate some frustrations and allow membership to articulate frustrations over the genocide in Gaza, but ultimately endorsed. We saw Bernie Sanders, who had this big movement behind him and all the popularity that we're seeing evidence of still now back in 2020, in a position to do sort of, it sounds like what you were advocating for, and use his popularity to force changes within the party. He sort of said he was doing that as he conceded to Joe Biden and said he got these commitments like that Joe Biden was going to fight for a $15 minimum wage. And we all saw what happened with that. So from my perspective, I don't disagree with what you're saying as a possible strategic approach. But to the extent that you're saying, well, Ralph Nader ran on the Bernie platform and barely got any votes, so we've tried that trajectory and failed. I would say the same thing of the Bernie can run for office, try a little entryism, run within the Democratic Party and try to use his popularity to change it. We've also seen that model tried and failed. And so what I would ask you is what you say to folks who might look at a different sort of historical model and say, well, the reason that we had the successes of FDR and the New Deal is because in the first half of the 20th century, not only was there a stronger labor force, but there were more radical left political organizations that were communist and socialist and in nature, and that made FDR the compromise position, that were genuinely threatening to the political establishment. Sure, go ahead.
Everything you've said is correct. Everything, and I agree with it 100%. There's one, I would say, one mistake in it, which is that FDR wasn't the, what was the word you used? Alternative? Compromise candidate.
Sure.
FDR came to power as the establishment candidate, and there was no third-party threat that they were responding to. That's just not true. But I don't think that weakens your position at all, Brandon. We may not disagree here. What I actually believe, nothing is possible in the United States without an independent party of working people. An independent party, however, whose main task is organizing, which is what the communists, the socialists were doing in the 1920s and 30s. They were not running third-party candidates electorally in any meaningful way. And the main reason is that they learned over the course of the past 35 years, once all the fusion laws were done away with in this country, nationally and locally, this is not just the United States, Brianna. Anywhere in the world, when you have a winner-take-all system, it's just really, really, really hard for third parties to break in electorally. It's just really hard because people don't want to waste their votes unless they think their party's going to win. So sorry, go ahead. So a third party, I think, is the first order of business. If it is a party, let me just use old-fashioned language so we're clear. It needs to be a party organizing for class struggle. It has to be a party bringing together working people and pressing the most vulnerable of the two parties and the most open, which are the Democrats. So for how long, I don't know. But right now, it's still the Democrats. In the short run, Brianna, pushing them as far left as they can go through challenging them in primaries, like what Hogg, I don't know what Hogg stands for, to be honest. I don't know if he knows what he stands for, but, in principle, pressing them for the right. And then also organizing working people, just as the communists, I think what the communists did from 28 to say 36, 37 is exactly the model. But that's different from having a viable electoral alternative as a third party.
So that's interesting. So what if, I think there is a presumption, maybe a legitimate one, that if I say, I think third parties are beneficial, that Bernie and the AOCs should funnel the energy that they're galvanizing into a third party as opposed to the Democratic Party, that it is exclusively or primarily for electoral purposes. But let's reframe it. Let's say everything that I just said, but I want it to be funneled into a third party for organizing purposes. Does that change it for you?
It changes it totally.
So then to me, I think let's say just the Green Party, since they are like the most persistent left third party in the country, gets a lot of flack for running people in elections. They obviously get tagged as spoilers. They are accused by people on the left as only being interested in running every 4 years. And one of the responses that they give to that is that to maintain our ballot lines, we have to run candidates. And we would love to do more, but we don't have very much in the way of resources. And if you want to change it, be the change you want to see and come join up and do that. So I take all of the criticism and the frustrations with these third parties on their face. I think those are legitimate criticisms in some respects. But what I don't understand is the choice to continue to bang one's head against the wall of the Democratic Party, which has demonstrated an unwillingness to have any flexibility. I mean, the David Hogg of it all, I have mixed feelings about him. On one hand, I'm like, good for you. I think it's right to be willing to challenge incumbents, not just because of age. I think that's a little bit missing the forest for the trees, but because they're not delivering for their constituents and because they're not reflective of the interests of working people.
Exactly. That's right.
But a part of me is like, this is deeply naive of you, David, to think that the Democratic Party was ever going to let you get away with this. Are you brand new here? I remember reporting for The Intercept back in 2018, or The Intercept reporting, I didn't write this, about how the Democratic Party, the DCCC, was threatening vendors who might work for people challenging incumbents, saying you'll never work in this town again. Oh, do you do catering? Oh, do you do lights? Do you set up stages? Do you print flyers for Democratic candidates? Never more if you do it for AOC, for instance.
Yeah.
And in the face of that kind of backlash, I mean, maybe we'll insert some clips of the kinds of framing the mainstream media has been using to talk about David Hogg.
Insane or intuitive? Tonight, Democrats are fighting over one high-profile party leader's plan to primary their own. David Hogg is a Parkland survivor and now a vice chair of the Democratic National Committee. He's also the head of a PAC that is putting $20 million behind an effort to replace Democratic lawmakers that Hogg sees as, quote, ineffective, asleep at the wheel members with Democrats who have the energy, passion, and vision to meet this moment with the urgency our country deserves. Now, the idea does not seem like it's going to win Hogg any popularity contests among his Democratic peers.
If you are an effective leader and you're listening to this right now and you're a member of Congress, you have nothing to be worried about. And if this brings you anxiety, you should ask yourself why that is, because there are young people out there ready to meet this moment, and our party must do a better job to show our young people that we're here to win them back. And look, I know that what I'm doing here isn't going to make everybody happy, but I am not here to make everybody happy. I am here to win.
Mandela,
dream for the Republican Party.
What is the Democratic Party vice chair doing with a PAC to take out Democrats?
I will say nobody's entitled to any position. Yeah. And you know what? I'm just going to say nobody's entitled to any position that they're in, right? Like, and he's not going to make friends by, launching in this endeavor. But the fact is, there are problems, there are challenges that we have as a party and things that do need to be addressed. The favorability of congressional Democrats is lower.
Is this the way to do it?
I'm not going to say if that's the way to do it or not.
I mean, you got to say something.
Hey, look, but I'll tell you, I got into politics.
I'm just saying, you're not in an elected position right now.
I know, but I got into elected office by primarying somebody.
Right.
That's how I got into office.
Nobody is saying don't primary somebody. I think the question is, Democrats have a lot of problems. Is the issue really taking out their own or adding to their numbers? Is it addition or is it subtraction?
I think the Democrats would benefit from some new energy, quite frankly. And
we love the fact that two Democrats going at each other. Let me just tell you something.
I don't really care what Republicans.
Media criticism you've gotten. Matt Bennett from the Clinton-Gore era. This is insane behavior. John Anzalone, pollster most recently for President Biden.
Yeah.
$20 million should be spent on swing state legislative races, meaning state legislative races, and down ballot, not on this. Steve Shale, a Florida Democratic strategist, saying the DNC's vice chair should be focused on this kind of engagement, meaning engaging in places in battleground states where Democrats have lost ground, not over which Dem in a plus 20 seat should be primaried and knocked out.
Look at the last results of the previous election. Those are the purported experts that brought us here. Just to say, it's not personal, right? I don't take those attacks personally in this regard. This is a strategic disagreement. And I want to be clear. All this money that we're raising is not only being spent on primaries by any means. That is the story that a lot of journalists and media run with. We are working
What are you
in
also
safer
going to spend
seats.
it on?
We're also going to be spending it on frontline seats where great young people are running, right, if they are the Democratic nominee, to make sure we're bringing in fresh faces to Congress.
I mean, they're treating him like a pariah for the the crime of saying you are allowed to run against Democrats.
Yeah.
That being who the Democratic Party is, I just don't understand the faith that some folks have in its rehabilitation.
No, there's no rehabilitating it, Brianna. Maybe we're talking past one another. I don't think we're disagreeing on much at all. You have to distinguish between tactics and strategy if you're on the left. Strategically, the Democrats are a wasteland. There is no changing, unless the party collapses. It's entirely possible. We're going through a profound crisis right now, political crisis, not an economic one, but there's a deep political crisis because American elites don't know what to do with this revolt that they're facing electorally. They don't know what to do because they have no intention of moving away from what is broadly called neoliberalism. And yet they have a population that wants to have nothing to do with it. So they're trying to figure out new ways of packaging it. The Democrats are packaging it by putting darker skin on their neoliberal agenda. The Republicans are doing it to a xenophobic nationalism. But either way, they're trying to figure out what to do. So in that situation, in this crisis, it's possible that one of these two parties just collapses. It's happened in the past. And if that happens, you would take the carcass in a Frankenstein way, revitalize it as the kind of party you would like to see. But I don't think that's on the cards. So strategically—
Why
not? Because these two parties are so well positioned to absorb what all dissent there is if they play their cards right, that the corporate community has nothing to gain by watching one of them die. Parties die when their main benefactors, which is, the people who call the shots in the system, the corporate elites, when the corporate elites find that they become entirely useless, or that they find that there's such an explosion that the voters are defecting away from it. Just something like the last time this could have been possible through voter defection was the New Deal era. And at that time, trade unions, I think, made the historic error of saying, no, we're going to stick with the Democratic Party, even though the popular explosion was so large that you could have tried a third party without facing the dilemma of the wasted vote of people saying, I can't vote for a third party. I think they would have done it. Nothing like that is in the cards right now. People are angry, but the more common response is just to opt out, So,
but should Bernie and AOC and whomever else on the left be angling for the collapse of the Democratic Party? Should they be trying to make what could have happened in the New Deal happen, the great voter defection?
It's not something they can control. When something like that happens, it's kind of like an earthquake. You see it happening, and then you either take advantage of it or not. You can't engineer it. It's very hard to engineer voter defection towards a third party when there's so much cynicism, when there's so much disconsolate views out there, and what people are the most likely scenario in 2028 is a gigantic anti-incumbency wave, not so much a call for a third party.
But why? I just want to probe that a little bit. What I'm about to say isn't dispositive by any means, but it's a little bit of evidence. You had RFK Jr., for instance, polling at like 20% at one point. Now, obviously, those polls collapsed, and you can say that wasn't real. But there did seem to be some appetite in the center because he attracted people from sort of this anti-establishment middle nexus for an alternative to both Donald Trump and, at the time, Joe Biden. You have these sort of Ross Perot anomalies that pop up that suggest that at various moments, significant chunks of the electorate are willing to go a different way. And one of what I feel like my goals are, one of my kind of obligation in this space is to clarify the extent to which the Democratic Party is only pretending to be a resistance party, occupying the space as sort of the left wing of what is a corporate duopoly. And for the purpose that people realizing the Democratic Party ultimately isn't going to work for them. Because until they come to that realization, they'll never work for anything on the alternative. And that's why it's so frustrating for me to watch Bernie and AOC go on an oligarchy tour where they will say, yeah, Democrats are a part of the oligarchy too, but won't ever do anything about it. Will tell you to vote for them at the end of the day in a way that makes that criticism completely meaningless. And in fact, sort of manufactures consent for the half of the oligarchy that's better than the alternative. So to me, if someone like AOC and Bernie took the same project up that I feel like I'm doing, which is to be very clear about who the Democratic Party is, we might live in a world, it seems to me, where there are more people who are willing to defect. And if you were part of the 30%, about 50% of the Democratic electorate who were pro-Bernie or Bernie curious, and it might be even more now, given how colossally the Democrats have failed. And it might be even more if Bernie's messaging was more pointed and critical of the Democratic Party in the way that, frankly, Donald Trump was willing to be critical and pointed about the Republican Party. Then I'm not saying magically, presto, socialist utopia is going to emerge, but I am interested in the possibilities of that. And I'm not so willing to say that that would be a fool's errand, not worth trying.
Let's take the best possible scenario for you. Let's say that you get 30% of the electorate to defect, and maybe some of the non-voting population is inspired and they come back out and they vote you into office. My worry is this. Now, this is partly, we've already done some magical thinking to think that this could happen, but let's just assume it can happen. Parties, if you look at British history, that's another first past the post system, winner take all system, and they've had some third parties emerge that had some electoral success. The lesson that comes out of it is, and this is much more true for the left than for the right, and I can go into why that's the case. For the left, you're not going to get very much by winning an election. You have to be able to then actually do two things: deliver on your promises, the promises to actually redistribute, to change people's lives, to move towards something like a Green New Deal or something like that. And that's not going to be done in a 2-year period between winning the presidency and the next midterm elections. That's going to take 2 to 3 presidencies to get it done.
Why?
Well, you're talking about tremendously restructuring patterns of investment in the United States and putting legislation into effect that's going to meet with an enormous amount of corporate resistance. So you're talking about a wave of social organizing and legislation. The New Deal, there was the first 100 days of the New Deal that passed a lot of legislation, but keep in mind, that was on the back of a massive labor movement. What you're going to have to do now is go up against the corporate class simply on the basis of an electoral victory. And those are two very, very different scenarios. Let me just, Brianna, illustrate
this.
Go ahead. So Biden in his administration passed all this in the first year of his office. They passed all this legislation because of COVID to give people childcare and tax relief. And that's when he was being called the most visionary president since LBJ. And they moved against the corporate community to some extent through their antitrust legislation and the increased regulatory apparatus that they put into place. But by the second year, all the redistribution was gone. And when Trump comes into office, one reason the tech sector defected to Trump was that they were incensed at what Lina Khan was doing and what the administration was. Now, so why does the Biden move to the left show that it's unsustained and that it triggers a backlash on the part of the corporations? It's because it was using the electoral gains to push to the left without creating any pressure and any sustained power on the streets or in workplaces where the corporate community feels they're going to have to live with these changes. Because if they don't live with them, there's also going to be consequences in their ability to run their businesses through a mobilized, a organized trade union movement. So what they saw was that Biden is trying to handcuff them, and there was no reason for them to put up with what he was doing, and they shifted over to Trump. If Bernie Sanders tries to come in and simply change a lot of legislation, the key for the left is not whether you can pass a law, it's whether you can keep it in place over time and whether you can maintain the kind of political power to then build on it over time. My worry is that if through that miraculous victory, if there isn't also sustained organization that can keep these legislations in place for years and decades on end, what you're going to find is a temporary blip of what appears to be legislative victories, and then a series of rollbacks, dejection, and increased cynicism again. The right faces very different sorts of constraints when they ride to power the way Trump did, because they're essentially aligned with what businesses want, even though there might be arguments over the details. And they have no problem changing their tunes when they find that they've overstepped. For the left, it's a different set of constraints. And that's why when you've seen third parties emerge in other countries with winner-take-all systems, the only ones that maintain any balance whatsoever, any toehold in the systems, are the ones that are somewhat right of center, because they can keep funders and backers behind them. Left of center parties have a very different set of constraints.
So this is an argument I'm familiar with, and I agree with in part. I think it is obviously true that the right's sort of public persona, their vibe is in line with their corporate backers' vibe. Like, their interests are aligned. And that makes their job a lot easier. Whereas Democrats have to, part of the whole point of identity politics is to find a progressive seeming veneer to sell what are ultimately neoliberal policies that benefit the corporate elites. That being said, I struggle with the assumption or the argument that Democrats cannot make things happen that stick when they're in office. It feels to me more like that is a choice that, again, is being dictated by corporate backers, which ostensibly wouldn't be an issue with a independent candidate like Bernie Sanders in this hypothetical. The examples that you raise with the child tax credit and all the COVID era policies, one criticism that I recall is that they were designed to lapse, which is a choice. They were pushed through in this must-pass budget reconciliation package, and could have been designed to not lapse, right? The whole point was there was this exigency around COVID and getting the vaccines out. And so there was a willingness even to get consensus among the kind of rotating villain mansion cinema Democrats to get this thing across the finish line, which was why there was all of this pageantry over the $15 minimum wage, which was initially in this bill and then was stripped from the bill by Chuck Schumer on advice of the parliamentarian. Because Democrats, it seems to me, get themselves in this position where they have to come up with an excuse for why they're not going to do the good thing, which is also the popular thing, which also would have been the lasting and permanent thing. A $15 minimum wage.
You're right. Let's just stipulate to this. Tactically, I think the Sanders wing could have played their cards better when Trump was elected. In my opinion, they should have focused on 2 or 3 key legislations rather than doing what they did, which is to just pile on whatever they could think of and see what sticks. That's true. And maybe we would have seen better results. But here's the thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In the year or the 9 months between proposing all these things and then the reconciliation bill actually getting pushed through, what you saw was all the progressive elements of that legislation slowly get cut down, whittled away. Why? It's not accurate to say that Democrats in a vacuum didn't have the strength of their convictions. It's because all these legislators had their corporate backers behind them saying, you're not going to pass this. There's just no way this is going through if you want to get through. My own reading of the cards is, if Manchin and Sinema had not been there, you would have seen more people come out in the Democratic Party and try to kill what Biden.
I agree. I agree.
That goes to my point, which is you win an election if you don't have real pressure on the Congress people, on the legislators, from their electorate, from an organized presence within their districts. You can win the election, you can propose the legislation, but in between those two ends, proposing the legislation and it getting passed through Congress, what you're going to find is a similar fate, which is legislators essentially killing it through 1,000 cuts, because those same corporate backers that were unable to stop the electoral victory of the left are now going to use their whatever power they have over the Congress people to kill the progressive legislation, either before it gets passed or after it's passed, to slowly whittle it away over the next 6, 8, 10 years. That's the worry. I don't think there's any shortcuts to real progressive, lasting progressive change through the state. If you're not going to organize the people, that's why I think the best thing to do when you have some power is to use it to do two things. Give some real tangible gains to people in their lives. And in my view, Sanders could have pushed for that by targeting 1 or 2 or 3 key things that he wanted, which would have made a huge difference, rather than tacking it on in lapsing legislation to the COVID bill. The second thing is you really need to push for better opportunities to organize people.
But here's the thing. Okay, Bernie Sanders picks one big thing, or one important thing, Medicare for all. If it needs to be something more, minimalist than that, $15 minimum wage. I don't really care. But let's just pick a thing.
Yeah.
To me, it so obviously doesn't matter because Biden can say no. Sorry, I tried. The parliamentarian told me I couldn't. And Bernie is never going to say, yes, you could.
Sure,
Bernie is never going to say the Democratic Party is intentionally fumbling the ball.
We're talking about your scenario where somebody miraculously gets 30% of the vote.
Well, no, I was going back to your scenario of what it looks like for the left to be using the power in this moment, like the AOC rally energy power, to push the Democratic Party, to have some leverage against the Democratic Party. And my argument is that there will never be that, because they are fundamentally unwilling to say anything that would damage the Democratic Party relative to the Republican Party. They are fundamentally unwilling to make the kind of critique that might actually sour people on the Democratic Party, like telling the truth about how the Democratic Party intentionally thwarts their interests, thwarts the passage of popular programs, that they are more beholden to these corporate interests and will whittle away Build Back Better the way you've described, even if it's popular. And I will confess, and I want to get into this, the organizing aspect of this, and some of the critiques that you've made of the potential of organizing and having a more robust left because of the diminishment of spaces like universities, unions as well, and churches, and all these are the kind of places that this stuff used to happen. But I have some skepticism, I confess, given what we're all talking about with respect to the power of corporate interests, of what it looks like for labor interests to be so powerful that those interests outweigh the corporate money.
So you mean labor's power, not labor's interest?
Labor's power. Labor's power. Yeah. Especially because we're in this moment of incredible exigency. And this has been kind of an ongoing theme of this podcast, that, of course, I'm not against both the historical reality of of labor power being determinative in populist gains, and two, that it needs to be restored, but also to have people in the throes of such exigency, which has only gotten worse now in the first months of Donald Trump's administration, and to be told this is how it has to happen, but also labor is so weak and this is many decades off in the future, feels almost disrespectful to the violence that people are under today. And while what I might be saying sounds like a lark and it doesn't happen like this and there's no shortcuts, it's difficult to look out at the energy that keeps manifesting, whether it's in the 2020 rallies or people furious about Palestine or people furious about Trump wrecking the economy or deporting students for speech, and not want to capture that energy.
No, but I don't think you're presenting accurately what's being said here. No one is saying you need to wait 30 years before anything good happens. What we're saying is, what do you do with this energy? The energy that's out there. My view is you organize. You organize it into hopefully something like a party, into neighborhood associations, into labor unions, whatever you can get. And this entire thing that you and I are talking about has come down to, what do you do about elections? Now, look, what we want to avoid is magical thinking. Each of us is saying the other is indulging in some degree of magical thinking. That's the problem. There is that both of us are correct. There is, like it or not, if you're going to say that we should form a third electoral party, there's about 200 years of experience now with elections.
Well, I don't know that I said that, though. I don't know that I said that. I said a third party, and I allowed for it to be whatever form of third party you need. But
well, then I don't know what it's not, because of course I agree with that entirely.
Well, so my fundamental question is, what I asked you is, do you think Bernie Sanders should be saying, and AOC, whomever, whatever interested Dem should be saying, don't vote for the Democrats. Don't invest in the Democrats. Let's take it out of the electoral realm. That all of this energy should not be funneled back toward them, that this is where you should go. This is the website you should sign up for to volunteer. This is where you should be sending your money.
I would say not don't vote for the Democrats. I would say don't trust the Democrats and organize yourselves.
But vote for them.
If you think that's what you want to do, I just don't think you can. If you tell people don't vote for the Democrats, they're going to go vote for the Democrats, Brianna. They're just going to do it.
Why do you say that?
Because that's what they do. That's what they do. Again, you have to have some empirical basis for saying, if I tell people don't vote for the Democrats, they'll follow me. By historical standards, what we're seeing here in the movement and the people coming to it's not even a blip. It's nothing by historical standards.
I think the argument is your vote for the Democrats should be conditional. Don't vote for the Democrats if they continue to fund a genocide in Gaza, for instance.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly fine.
I think the framing has to be to make it clear that the Democratic Party has choices. They have choices to stop a genocide. They have the choice to pass a $15 minimum wage. They have the choice to implement Medicare for all. They have the choice to make it illegal to do insider trading as a Congress member.
But people take their voting choices as deeply personal. And for some weird reason, even though no vote matters at all, they think their vote matters. And that's good. That's great. So my view is, when these elections, the past elections happened, if people who were saying I can't vote for a party that supported a genocide, I was like, yeah, absolutely, you shouldn't. If you feel that you can't, then there's somebody who says, look, I feel my family depends on Medicaid, and I really, really hate what's happening in Palestine, but I need these Medicaid checks to keep coming. I tell them, yeah, I understand, do it. These are real choices, and they have real consequences, and both choices are correct. Both of them are correct. The response ought to be vote with your conscience, but put your energies into building real power. Whatever you want. I call myself a socialist. You can call yourself whatever you want. I think if you start haranguing and lecturing people on how they should vote, they're just going to ignore you because they take their votes very seriously. I think for those of us on the left, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think for people what I've seen after studying this stuff for a long time and engaging with people, they are not going to be moved on these decisions of voting because the trick of capitalism, a bourgeois society, is that it imposes impossible choices onto people, absolutely impossible choices. And if they think that this evil party that happens to be less evil than the other one is their lifeline right now, as a practical matter, they're going to ignore you if you tell them not to do it. However, they recognize that it's a horrible party. And so that's why I think it's better to say, they're probably going to stab you in the back. Don't have any illusions. If you think right now this is the thing to do, fine. But listen, elections are just a tiny part of politics. What we need to do is recognize that what we're fundamentally fighting over is power. Not which party has office, but power. Elections are a part of power, but only one part of it. And for people like us on the left, we're going to have to rely on other sources of power. Now, one might disagree with that, but you need to have historical evidence to say that, no, I think this other strategy is real. And I'm open to it. God only knows. You're right, Brianna. Labor's flat on its back. The only thing I would say to you is that the gains in labor, in union density, et cetera, they have never been molecular. You don't go from 9 to 10, from 10 to 11. Historically, what's happened is you've gone from 9 to 20 and from 20 to 50 in a matter of 3 years. We don't know how. We don't know why. But all gains in trade union density have come in leaps. Thank God for that, because if it wasn't in leaps, I would just give up. Because I don't see any incremental gains in union density in the near future. So to my mind, use the elections to the best of your ability. Use this party, and that's why tactics and strategy are different. You tactically use the Democrats to whatever extent you can, but everything you're saying is true. They're going to stab you in the back. They'll sell you out. It's just that people right now, because of their desperation, they're not going to listen to you if you tell them prioritize this over that, Palestine over your Medicaid bill. They're
But
just not
that's
going to do it.
I don't think that's what I'm saying. And I also don't think that Bernie and AOC are saying Democrats are going to stab you in the back.
No,
they're saying
not.
Vote for Democrats.
Yes, they are. And I think that's a mistake.
And they're fundraising historic amounts of money, $9 million AOC for the Democrats, not saying to those big rallies.
You and I are focusing on these teeny things we disagree about, but we really agree on 98% of everything else, which is what they're doing with these rallies. I don't think is going to be productive.
Yeah, and there's a world where that $9 million is being raised for strike funds, and that they're talking about labor stoppages, and that we're talking about a different kind of protest that's not watching the cherry blossoms around the National Monument on April 5th, but is obstructing traffic and shutting down commerce. And then we'll see what the mainstream media figures have to say about Bernie and AOC and these rallies. And
I don't closely follow the rallies, but to my knowledge, they're not even saying go out and organize.
Right.
I frankly don't know what the point of these rallies is, other than understand that you're not alone in your anger, which is not trivial. Again, it's not a trivial thing to say. But if you want to make lasting change, you got to say more than that. And I wish Bernie. I don't expect a lot of AOC, so I'm going to direct this to Sanders. I wish he were doing more than what he's doing with these rallies. I don't see them as being a vehicle for the kind of outcomes we need.
Do you think, as you've watched the left, the actual left, try to wrestle with what to do in this political moment, that the failure to sort of exploit, for lack of better words, both the discontent around the lack of a primary, the Biden campaign, his obvious senility, and the ultimate failure of the Harris campaign, and now the disaster of the Trump campaign, has to do with a lack of sort of analytical rigor and historical perspective on the left? And if so, what do you think we should know that would inform our analysis in this moment?
No, I don't think it's because of a lack of analytical rigor at all, because this stuff is really easy. It's the basics of how to, it has to do with people. So you said the actual left, by which I imagine you mean an anti-capitalist left or a socialist left or something like that. The basic problem there is that they don't exist. There's maybe a dozen of them. A dozen individual people or something like that. In the United States, like when I go on to interviews and I talk about how the left has problematic notions or is captured, I'm really talking about the left in scare quotes, which is essentially the left today is housed within liberalism, is an offshoot of it, and is the left is the left wing of the professional classes, which is engaged in a civil war that's occurring within the top 20% of the population. So the basic problem of the left, the real left, the anti-socialist left, is it basically is down to zero right now, Brianna. It's a few intellectuals here and there, a few podcasters, a few journalists, but that's not meaningful if you want a left. A left exists only insofar as it has some kind of presence, organized presence within ordinary people, working people. Because it does not, most people that I know on the left, the real left, know what needs to be done. Problem is, they're so far, myself included, are so far removed from real people's lives that you can't really effectuate anything. And that's why we keep saying, hopefully labor movement gets going, because if neighborhood association, it's not just by labor movement, we don't mean just unions. We mean working people through whatever organizational carapace they find for themselves. If they get going, they will throw up their own leaders. They'll make people like me completely irrelevant, because my contribution, whatever analytical, historical knowledge I have, it's not what's really needed, because the stuff it takes to win is blindingly simple. Blindingly simple. The left, when it had actual weight and power, it was just ordinary people writing pamphlets, because what it takes to figure out the fundamentals is just confronting capital and the wealthy every day in your lives and figuring out and seeing what it takes to organize your brethren around you, your brothers and sisters around you. So pointy heads like me we can be useful in some downstream crap that comes about design policy and things like that, Brianna. But the real problem right now is that the last 40 years of political struggles, political battles destroyed whatever organizational and institutional power and anchor that the real left had. It dissipated, it got destroyed, it became disillusioned, it went off into nonprofits, universities, and then it was sucked up by them and just made completely either irrelevant or some kind of toxic mix of identitarianism, ultra-leftism, and posturing. That's where we are right now.
I know I'm a dog with a bone here, and I really don't mean to be. But I guess I'm trying to reckon with my frustration about the gap between sort of like the prescriptive advice and what feels like certain realities that we have experienced in the last few years. For example, I want to confess that when I hear people say we need to organize, it's like my mind goes blank.
Yeah, I understand.
It's like, okay, great. Yeah. Let me get right to that. Like you're saying that people are atomized, that we don't have these spaces in which community relationships were formed and organizing used to happen and trust could be built. We don't have leaders who are willing to clearly articulate the problem and implicate the Democratic Party as part of the problem so that people even know what they're organizing against. And on the other hand, you have the reality that, well, I know that I'm not supposed to say everything's about elections, and I'm supposed to say that we over focus on electoral politics, and I know that I'm supposed to say all of those things, but it is also true that my observation is that the fact of Bernie running for president in 2016 radicalized a lot of people and helped them understand their political identities differently, and I'm one of those people.
And Brianna Nader did not.
And that's
identical
fine.
program.
The argument is not that.
Now you have a bone, and I'm going to try to chew away at that bone a bit.
But
there's
I
a
just
reason
want to be really clear. The argument isn't Bernie Sanders should have run as the Green. The argument is that Bernie Sanders should have run as a Democrat and then used the energy he was able and the attention he was able to garner because he was on the debate stage, because he was a Democratic candidate, to clarify the contradictions of the Democratic Party, not to funnel people back into it. And to also funnel people into other organizations, including an alternate political organization, a party organization.
You will agree that's a very fine knife's edge, that is a tightrope to walk. And it's an art, not a science, because he's running as a Democrat. He has to also say, vote for me as a Democrat, and I'm going to make a material change in your lives, while also calling attention to how bankrupt and corrupt the Democratic Party is.
Yes.
In my opinion, he did that about as well as you could. You have to do it in a way that your attacks on the Democrats are not so explosive that you end up undermining your own campaign as a Democrat. So please don't gloss over the difficulty of doing that.
No, I don't think I'm glossing over it. But I mean, there were a lot of people on the campaign that were frustrated because they don't think that he walked the tightrope line effectively, that he was much too conciliatory, and that he says, I welcome your hatred, and we're fighting up against all of these entrenched interests, and it's not going to be easy. He'll say things like that, but when it comes time to say, is Biden corrupt? He won't do it. Zephyr Teachout famously wrote this article to that effect, that the campaign walked back, that Bernie walked back and said, no, I don't think that Joe Biden is corrupt. That's crazy. And if you aren't even willing to land the punch of the man who took more money from billionaires and who has openly opined about how, you give me money, you're the first to get a call back, is corrupt, then what are we even doing? What are we even saying?
I agree.
And contrast that with Donald Trump and what he was willing to say about the Republican Party while still ostensibly walking a tightrope that makes him a credible Republican leader.
Well, So let me stipulate that I agree with you. I think in his second campaign, Sanders made a mistake in after Super Tuesday, when he sees he can't win, he threw his weight behind Biden unconditionally. I think that was a huge mistake. If that's what you're talking, I thought you were talking about while he was still a viable candidate, what should he have done to call attention to the Democrats? I think these are two different scenarios.
I think that in both cases he should have. Yeah, go ahead.
While he was a candidate, we can only go by your impressions. I thought in 2016 he did much better than 2020. In 2020, I thought the main problem was he was browbeaten by these consultants who came in and said, you got to be more conciliatory on identity issues, and you're pissing off the college crowd, and you got to make sure that you keep their vote. I think he diluted his populism somewhat.
I know that's an argument. I disagree with that argument.
That's fine. I think people can have different political judgments. What I wanted to do was agree with you about, because I'm trying to find everything we agree about, so to make sure that we're not just digging in on what might be relatively unimportant issues in our political debate here, political discussion, I should say. So he absolutely did, I think, make a mistake in throwing his weight behind Biden. But I would just caution in making the comparisons with Trump, because Bernie and everybody like him in the Democratic Party is burdened with something that Trump was not burdened by, which is that if Trump, from his standpoint, if he wages a campaign that's a slash and burn campaign and it destroys the Republican Party, he doesn't care, not because he's a narcissist, which he is. Somebody like him doesn't have to care, because even if the party falters, somebody else will come in and take their place, because all the money, all the power in society from the corporate community is making sure that somebody is there to take care of their interests. So if institutions break down, they'll create new ones because they got all the money in the world. If parties break down, they'll create new ones. The thing about progressives is they're burdened with the realization that if they fail, nobody else is going to step in. The corporate class, the ruling class, will be perfectly happy to see their party burn. So they do. I think Bernie Sanders and others in the Democratic Party left did feel that if Manchin and Sinema are allowed to dig in and you make no concessions to them, what's going to happen is the entire bill goes down and you're left with nothing. Trump is willing to break the entire global economy. He doesn't care. Now, what you're saying is, you're saying to them, call the bluff. That's what you're saying.
Yes, we were just talking about how parties fail, how to get a new party is to have a party fail. And I asked you, well, should we be trying to, accelerate the failure of the Democratic Party? Like, is that?
You can't do it unless you have a viable alternative. You just can't. You can't. Accelerationism has this problem, is that you're heaping more difficulties onto a population that's already on the verge. It is politically irresponsible to say, let the party burn unless you have something that can take its place, Brianna. You're not going to build it.
I would argue that there aren't people that are on the verge. I would argue that there are people who have been well beyond the verge for a very long time, who get ignored in these conversations. We were talking about how people think their votes are precious. They don't want to be told who to vote for. They don't want to be harangued, et cetera. I would argue there are a lot of people who don't, it's not that they don't feel that their vote is precious, but they are non-voters. They are people who stay home because they do not feel represented. They understand the extent to which neither party is working for them. And they are already making a voting choice.
Yeah. And all I'm saying is,
and these are disproportionately the more working class, low income people.
The non-voters are primarily working class people. They're primarily the people who are the worst off. What I'm saying is that you're right, that the Democratic Party is not reformable. It's not in the long run going to be a party that represents working people. And I agree that you shouldn't be trying to reform it. This is all about, in the short run, can you use it for something? You're saying you can't use it even in the short run. I'm saying I wish that I agree with you that it's extremely difficult to do so, but we don't have viable alternatives. We don't. And so,
but also we're not going to build viable alternatives. Do you see how this feels circular?
Well, yeah, I think so. And I think that is because we are in a no-win situation right now, and we're trying to. Both of us are grasping a different horn of a dilemma.
I guess I do not accept that. I do not accept that it's a no-win situation. And I worry that framing it in that way is demobilizing. I think that you and I both, we can call it, we refer to each other as both doing magical thinking, or accusing each other of doing magical thinking. And I accepted that as true in part. But I don't know that it is that magical. Like, okay, I'm not the historian, so let me ask you. From my brief history lesson that I had to do when I was joining a worker strike or socialist alternative, I was happy to read about the French 68 uprisings. And what I recall from the pamphlet that I was instructed to read was that this was a revolution that started with students, followed by the police cracking down on them. And because so many of the factory workers were the parents of these students were like the first generation of people who were being able to move into these more white collar jobs, they were upset. And then the work stoppages and the broader labor participation followed, right? And that there was a relatively spontaneous uprising. Now, what we hear is that things don't happen spontaneously. You can't rely on things happening spontaneously. There are no shortcuts. I understand that. It is also true that it seems to be the case that sometimes our conditions, the sense of threat congeal and something revolutionary sparks. It's not something that you can design. It's not something you can control, but it's something that happens. And what I'm seeing on the left, what I see so much of is some folks will say, we need to have a general strike. And then all of the big brains.
I need to have wings. You can't just say we need to have
you're doing exactly. I'm glad you said that.
The people who say that are absolute clowns. You know what it takes to have a general strike? Do you know how much?
This is the point.
This is just ridiculous. I know people say it, but it should be something people laugh over.
So you're illustrating my point. You're illustrating my point. So one response to that could be, I hear you. This is something that will need to happen. Like, you're talking about all this labor growth and stuff that also is not going to happen tomorrow, but you can acknowledge that this is something that would help to make a meaningful change. So instead of saying it's a fantasy to say we need to have a general strike, there's a response that says, yeah, you're right, and it's really hard. Let's talk about what it requires to support such a thing. And then we're getting to a place where that feels constructive to me, that says, what are the obstacles to a general strike?
What are the obstacles? No unions. How are you going to have a general strike?
But there are also wildcat strikes, right?
Yeah,
we had the
tiny.
whole 2018. I'm sorry.
They're tiny.
They are tiny. What would it take to make them bigger?
A union.
But do you see how this might they also be bigger? Might people feel more empowered?
By definition, wildcat strikes are strikes against union
that
contracts.
are unsanctioned. Yes.
So now what you want is a wave of strikes. That's what you're talking about. A wave of strikes. I mean, it's happening, but it's been in very specific circumstances. It's
like
happened.
What?
It's only you already have some kind of organizers in workplaces that are politically motivated and are ideologically trained. They're just not inside unions right now. You don't have that. I mean, we don't have to go into a discussion about what causes general strikes. I just want to call attention to the absurdity of people going on Twitter.
But why not? Because, Vivek, it seems to me that, one, if you think that people are being absurd, I mean, these are people on the left who want good things to happen. So one, I don't think it's particularly useful to be sort of uncharitable when you're having communications in group like this. And also, I think that it would be much more useful to have a conversation about what it requires to have a general strike, and put people, instead of just saying organize, say you're organizing with the goal of supporting a general strike, or you're organizing the goal with supporting a wave of wildcat strikes.
Brenna, general strike is when workers around the country go on strike together.
Yes.
What it takes is to organize. That's what it takes. So I don't know what we're talking about here. Let's just get back to basics. I do not disagree at all that you should be trying to organize a third party. I do not disagree at all that you should be calling attention to the unreformable nature of the Democratic Party. All we're saying is, in the short run, there are people, you have to cop to the reality that people are going to vote Democrat if they want to. They're just going to, no matter how much you
people
tell
are
them.
going to.
So given
People are
that
gonna
they
vote.
are, don't pour your energies into saying don't vote Democrat. Pour your energies into saying organize people.
No, I think it's if they want to is an important qualifier. I think that at the very minimum, part of the project is to make people not want to by telling them the truth about the Democratic Party. And that is why I'm seeing I very much disagree with that. I think the people who know the truth about the Democratic Party are already non-voters.
No.
All the poor and working class people.
Because they hate them.
And I think the bulk of the people, liberals who vote for Democrats, think that they are meaningfully good. They're well-meaning. That to the extent that the Democratic Party doesn't pass good things or gets like owned by Republicans or like loses the court, it's because they were foiled, because the Republicans are cheating and they're unfair.
Yeah,
because
but now
there's some bad apples within.
Sure, you're talking now about people who are like ideologically articulate and who have political views and who read the newspapers and things like that. Those are liberals.
That's a lot of that's a lot of
But it's
voters.
not the people we're trying to in the first instance organize. The people we're in the first instance trying to reach out to are basically, most of the American electorate is apolitical, non-ideological. Its political identity is pretty thin.
And many of them are non-voters. So it does. Sure. Do you see how this? I feel like there's some inconsistencies here.
There's not. I'm sorry, Brianna. I don't mean to be rude, but if you want to get the non-voters out, you're going to have to go in and get them. You're going to have to go in and get them physically, which is going to take organizing.
I don't. Okay.
It's going to take a real political party that has roots inside these communities that goes in and tells them, come out and vote. And when they do that, they're going to want to know, well, who am I voting for? And you're going to say, this thing right here, the Greens or the Workers' Revolutionary Party or something like that. And they're going to say, look, man, I'd rather just go home because they're not going to do it. They're not going to win.
It feels, I want to try to put words to what I am experiencing, and you tell me if I'm getting something wrong here. It feels like you're saying that we need to organize, but also pointing to the limitations of historical roots to effectively organize. And then saying once you've organized people, they have to be organized into an institution, which doesn't exist. But also the people who have platforms to direct energy and attention to those institutions shouldn't do so because you can't tell people not to support the Democratic Party because you can't direct people in that way. And so it starts to feel to me like every potential avenue for change has like a built-in, but that's not going to happen. And so I guess I would just put to you really directly, can you say what should happen, and can you describe it you can describe organizing, but without using the word organized, with using words that are more specific?
You need to, in my opinion, in the short run and the long run, there are different things you need to do. In the short run right now, it is a fact, as you have said, that people in this country pay attention to politics primarily around elections. Mm-hmm. Given that, it all comes down to whether in those elections you're going to ask them to vote for a third party or the lesser of the two evils. My opinion is you're going to be effective if you figure out ways in particular localities to use the existing ballot line to either popularize your ideas in those elections so that you can bring people together into associations of various kinds in neighborhoods and in workplaces. And in larger canvases like presidential elections, try to figure out ways of bringing together enough voters in enough kinds of associations to vote for the lesser of the two evils so that you can push for legislative and judicial changes that remove some of the obstacles that are in the way of movement building. Now, that's a strategy that might very well fail. I absolutely agree. The difference between me and you is in our assessment of what is more unrealistic. You think it's more unrealistic to try to use the existing institutions in the short run for tactical reasons to try to open up spaces for movement building and power in the long run. I think it's more unrealistic in the short run to venture out of those institutions like the Democratic Party and try to do something entirely independently of it. The reason we're going around in circles, Brianna, is that both of these neither of us has good historical reasons to believe which of these can work. And that's because the left has never been in the situation that it is today. Never. It's never been as intellectually, politically, and organizationally as weak as it is today. That's the reality. That's why I know that your view is what it is, and I don't begrudge it because I understand the frustration with the kinds of remedies that I'm recommending. I understand it.
I don't know that I have frustrations with your remedies, and I wouldn't describe myself as not being willing to use the Democratic Party. I want to be really clear that I was Bernie Sanders' national press secretary.
And I want to be very clear until about 8 years ago, I was all third party.
So what happened? What happened to that?
Sanders happened. Yeah, I saw what he was able to do.
Well, that's a bummer. Like, that's an indictment. I would argue that that's exactly why there should be a lot of skepticism around the sheep herding inclinations of people like Senator Sanders. And why is it that someone like this is in the space?
I agree. I think what Sanders did was he squandered what leverage, what opportunities he had. I agree. And he ended up sheep herding people into a wasteland. I agree.
Well, I certainly didn't intend for this conversation to be quite as narrow as it was, although I do enjoy mooting some of these issues. I do think this is the question. And while I strongly recommend that people go and listen to your episode on Doom Scroll with Joshua Citarella, because I had planned to follow up on some of these other issues.
Well, you can edit some of this stuff out if you want to talk about the other things.
No. Not at all. I actually, unfortunately, have another recording at 3:30, so I have to hop off, or I would stay on here with you for a very long time. But I hope you can come back sometime and talk about some of this other stuff, and maybe we'll have some more sort of ideas about potential vectors for change as the Donald Trump administration continues on, and people are maybe increasingly radicalized and increasingly open to different kind of political opportunities, which I would argue maybe we are seeing with the attendance at the Bernie rally.
Not just that attendance. I think we're in a very fluid moment politically, where you might be able to make enormous steps forward for some kind of alternative to the Democratic Party. And I would very much, I agree with you. We need a third party. Our only skepticism, which we spent 90 minutes going over and over on, my only skepticism is I don't think it's in any position to be an electoral vehicle just yet. But I don't think we'll make very much progress at all in this country on the left without an organized presence of a third party.
Would you be willing to endorse and support and work on a third party effort to, say, develop the PSL or the Green Party as an organizational vehicle?
Neither of those has any hope for ever being a vehicle for anything. I would be willing to support a third party, but the Greens have the Greens are not going to go anywhere. They've been around for 30 years.
PSL?
Perhaps, but it would have to be a different kind of party. Now that would have been an interesting discussion to have. But what indication have you seen from the Greens that they're going to become a party that extends beyond the professional classes?
You can do whatever you want to do. But this willingness to reform, but the willingness to like use the Democratic Party, but not use the Green Party, and with its ballot access and basic infrastructure.
Yeah, the Democratic Party has power, and
that's why it's so difficult to change. The Green Party is basically standing there saying, "Please join, change, make it what you want to be." And for some reason, there's this what it feels to me like an untethered antagonism for it. And I say untethered, like I don't know where it's coming from.
Well, watching it for 25, 35 years and seeing the kind of stuff that it rolls out. If it changes, that's great. It's fine. Right now, the Greens are a party of the kind of left wing of the professional classes right now.
And so is the Democratic Party.
Yes, but that's why I would like to see, if we're going to have a third party, I would like to see a party of working people, of labor. I have no interest in supporting one other wing of the professional class.
I agree, but certain other labor sort of organizing efforts like Shama Sawant and Workers Strike Back see the benefit of working with the Green Party and trying to reform the Green Party. Or PSL. I note that I threw out PSL as well, and you seem to lump them in with the Greens, but don't seem to have the specific sort of criticisms for them.
These are very small organizations that right now don't have any connection with much. I mean, the DSA is building much more enduring presence within labor, within the working class right now. And
so
I think
should the DSA start a political party? Because as I understand it, they have committed to not being a political organization.
I know. I wish they would. I wish they would. Right now, they're not a party. If they could become a party, I think it would do a lot of good. I don't think they will. I don't think this could have been a good conversation to have. I don't think they will become a party primarily because if they become a party that's actually a party of labor, they'll lose about 60 to 70% of their members.
And what Shama? Well, that's a problem.
Yeah.
What Shama Sawant says is, I'd rather be a smaller party that actually has power and that is able to get results like they were able to get with the $15 minimum wage in Seattle, than to have a party that can boast big membership and I guess lots of dues, but that is unwilling to flex any political muscle.
Yeah. My view is that socialist action, that's what it's called.
Socialist alternative. Yeah.
The social alternative.
But now they do it. Now it's Workers Strike Back.
Yeah, it's been a very tiny party for a very long time. And look, Brianna, I've been on the far left for 30 years. I've seen a dozen or 20 of these tiny parties that establish a foothold in a city. They're able to do some small thing. They never come out of the wasteland. So if you're going to have a third party, you need to think big. And it's got to be more than something that attracts a couple of hundred people that are very committed, but are very confined in what they can do. And that party right now, the only party organization that has a hope of becoming that is the DSA. I'm skeptical as to whether it can. But I'll endorse other parties, but they're glorified social clubs, these parties. And adding my name to that will change nothing. But of course, I'm happy to, I would endorse any such thing.
It feels like such a self-fulfilling argument.
No, it's not. These things don't happen through individuals doing this or individuals doing that. It's a symbolic point. I can symbolically add my name to something. The point here is just with a sober mind, sitting down and thinking about what kind of party it would take to actually effectuate change. I don't know of any party that didn't already have a strong base within the working class that started with 12 people and then worked its way up to becoming a national party.
So a party that doesn't exist seems more promising to you than a party that exists and at least has some infrastructure and ballot access as a vehicle to growing a labor party.
That is correct. And the reason I'm optimistic is that I think we're living in a moment where some such party could come into being. And what contribution people like myself and other intellectuals and analysts can make is help create a perspective and orientation amongst organizers that sees the importance of working people and the power that resides in capital to help orient organizing efforts in a direction that if such a party comes along, it has the program and the platform that's pointing in the right direction. But I was in organizations like the ones you're talking about. I spent 15, 18 years in them. I have no desire to go back into that wilderness again.
As opposed to doing what?
You do what you can. You do what you can, and I do what I can to help sharpen analysis, to create a perspective, to expose power. That's all intellectuals can do. Both of us are in some way or form intellectuals. But
I don't know that I put myself into that bucket. I'm a humble podcaster, but I really do appreciate you taking the time with us here today, Vivek. Can you tell the audience where they can find more of you and your work on the internet?
We have
beyond.
We have a podcast that we started 4 months ago called Confronting Capitalism. That's on Jacobin Radio. And of course, I'm a published author, so you can go find the books that I've written. And I write for Jacobin every now and then, so you can find things there.
All right, I appreciate it. And I promise next time you come back, I'll figure out how to get us off a very, very narrow train into some of the more substantive analysis that you've done that it really is interesting. And I, again, Shirley, recommend both your podcast and the interview that I was happy to catch with you and Josh over on Doom Scroll. Thank you again to you for joining us. Thank you to the listeners for staying with us through this episode. You know, you can get an extra episode of Bad Faith Podcast every week on Mondays at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Remember to take care of yourselves, and as always, keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you, and as always, keep the faith.